It's my pleasure to introduce two of my very good friends, Deepak Chopra and Rudy Tanzi. And I'll introduce them in a second and say that they'll talk for about an hour and a half between the two of them, mostly about their book, Super Genes. And then we will have a panel discussion on which they'll also be a part on does consciousness guide evolution, a somewhat controversial idea, and we'll have proponents of both sides. And they include Stuart Kauffman, a noted evolutionary biologist, Catherine Peel from Harvard Divinity School and Northeastern University on emotions being intrinsic to the universe, and Baba Brinkman, who is a rapper, a science philosophy rapper who's been appearing on off-Broadway and has rap shows about climate change and evolution, and has had some amazing write-ups in the New York Times about that. And he was at our conference 2 years ago rapping about consciousness. And he is actually more of a conventional Darwinian, neo-Darwinist. So he'll be even though he's the rapper, he'll be presenting the more or less conventional viewpoint. So Deepak Chopra is probably known to almost everybody. Several years ago, Time magazine had a survey of the world's leading spiritual leaders. And as I recall, number 3 was the Pope, number 2 was Dalai Lama, and number 1 was Deepak. And I'm very privileged, I'm very happy to say he's a friend of mine, but I also have to note that he has about 80 million friends. So it's not that it's that exclusive a company, but he's a wonderful guy. And he has a lot of friends. There you see with the late Michael Jackson, Oprah, and just about every celebrity you can think of is or has been a friend of Deepak's. Rudy Tanzi is a noted geneticist. He discovered Alzheimer's expert at Harvard and Mass General. He discovered one of the major genes leading to Alzheimer's, has developed a model system, a 3-dimensional mini brain that is used as a model system to study Alzheimer's and other pathologies. A major player in Alzheimer's research. Now, Rudy's no slouch either when it comes to celebrity friends. He's also a musician. I don't know if you can see this very well, but he jams with Aerosmith and has cut a solo album with Joe Perry and Iggy Pop and a few other people. And we hope that we'll get him to perform later at the hospitality suite party after all the business is done. So, and then I mentioned the panelists who will be appearing later. So without further ado, and hopefully I won't mess this up, I would like to bring up and ask for a round of applause for Dr. Deepak Chopra, who I should mention, wait, hold the applause, was just awarded a full professorship at the University of California, San Diego. Let's give a big round of applause for Deepak Chopra.
Thank you, Stuart. And I just want to acknowledge that Stuart's been a great friend of mine, and we've been doing stuff together for many years. And a lot of people think I'm a total flake, but having Stuart as a friend gives me a lot of credibility. So thank you, Stuart. So this evening we're going to talk about how consciousness guides evolution. I'd like to show you a video to start with. What happened immediately after your parents came back from that picnic. Let's have it. So about 5 years ago, when we first made that video with a friend of ours, some people asked, why does it take 200 million sperm to fertilize one egg or get to one egg? And the only explanation they came up with was that guys don't like to stop for directions. So 200 million, one of them made it. So at that moment, there were about 23,000 genes in the fertilized ovum, half from your mother, half from your father. And I know a lot of you are scientists, but when I speak to general audiences, I like to make things simple. A gene is a stretch of DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, that codes for a protein or for a unit of heredity. So think of genes as words. If DNA is the alphabet of life, and DNA has 4 letters, as you know, adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, so A, T, C, and G. It takes only 4 letters to make all of life, whether it's a fruit fly or a banana or a chimpanzee or a crocodile or a human being. So English needs 26 letters. Life needs only 4 letters. The actual carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen that makes those chemical bases comes from a distant galaxy, from a burning star. So the carbon in your fingernails the oxygen in your hemoglobin, the nitrogen in some other tissue could have come from different galaxies. During the 9 months that it takes to make a baby, as one cell divides into two, two into four, a process that's called morphogenesis. Morphogenesis means to give rise to form. And differentiation, how the one becomes the approximately 100 trillion cells in your body, which is more than all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So this is a very, as you saw, very interesting process where you have differentiation of just one cell into all these different cells, heart cells and brain cells and kidney cells. And as you saw, it's a very, very finely tuned orchestration of events. There's self-regulation going on, there's differentiation going on, there's self-organization going on, there is evolution, because during those 9 months of embryogenesis, the genome remembers the entire evolutionary history of all life forms. So you start like a little bacterial organism, and then you differentiate and you become a rodent, you have a reptilian brain, ultimately become a mammal, going through all the stages of evolution. As you become a mammal, you have a limbic brain, and then finally you emerge as a human being with a cortical brain. All of evolution is remembered. The memory of evolution is there. But more than the memory of evolution, there's the memory of the cosmos, because it takes the whole universe to conspire to create you or to create any biological organism. It takes the whole universe, and it doesn't matter if you believe in chaotic inflation or multiverses, none of that matters. The fact is, you are here because there were finely tuned constants in the universe, from the gravitational constant to the Planck constant to the speed of light, to everything had to be accurate to the decimal point for us to be here in this room. 13.8 billion years of cosmic evolution with mathematical precision. So don't let anyone tell me this is random. As you come out into the world through the birth canal, provided it's not a cesarean section, then you inhale the secretions of your mother, the vaginal secretions, and you also breathe them in. And of course, you're covered with them, and you acquire your second genome, which is called the microbiome. So the human genome is 23,000 genes, but now you acquire 2.2 million additional genes, which represent the ecosystem of our planet. It's the second genome. And now you show up in the world and you start to have experiences. Your parents touch you and they cuddle you and they kiss you and they engage with you in emotion. With emotion, you hear sounds, you experience touch, taste, sight, smell. You have interaction, which is at the level of thought and feeling and emotion. And this creates a third structure, which you'll hear about today at length, which is the epigenome, which is above the genome, a sheath of proteins created by your genome, but in turn regulating your genes. So now you have an exquisite integrated interplay between the microbiome, 2.2 million genes, the genome, 23,000 genes, and the epigenome, which regulates this integration. So when Rudy and I met in the urinal after a TEDMed conference, and we were next to each other, I said, Rudy, are genes nouns or verbs? Or the brain, I think it was. And he said, let's go out and we'll have a conversation. And so here we are. Your body is not a noun, it's a verb. It's an activity of non-change in the midst of change, which we call homeostasis, but it's also, in fact, changing at the same time. And these are the activities in consciousness that are regulating your body. Sensory experience, sleep, waking, breathing, nutrition, metabolism, elimination, interaction with nature, ultimately the whole universe, and thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories and desires. Something happened to this. Can you bring it on again? So, all these activities, which I hope to convince you, and with Rudy's help, which are activities in consciousness, are constantly creating a. Okay, thank you. Are creating this experience that we call a physical body. And thoughts, emotions, memories, desires, imagination, as you grow up, creativity, insight, intuition, intention, all have a role to play. And these are the 5 things that seem to be most important as we look at the body. And I just want to say that in the Vedic tradition of India, sleep is a spiritual state of non-dual awareness, where there is no subject-object split, and you're back where you came from. And so now we know that sleep is probably the most efficient way to improve your health. You eliminate toxins, you create order from chaos, you renew your body, you repair it, you strengthen and optimize immune function, you consolidate memories, you process unconsciously in deep sleep, you process information in deep sleep. So in the Vedic tradition of India, deep sleep is actually almost the same as soul consciousness. You're returning to your core being. And that's why deep sleep also increases creativity. You solidify what you learn, you think clearly, and you balance your hormones. So recently, after Rudy and I got together, thanks to some friends of ours, I convinced Elizabeth Blackburn, who's a Nobel laureate at UCSF, to come to our center where we have a 1-week course which is called Seduction of Spirit. During this course, people go into deep meditation, and what they practice is self-reflection. They practice self-awareness. They practice awareness of the body. They practice awareness of their breath. They practice awareness of mental space, thoughts, feelings, emotions. And then they learn to transcend through a mantra practice. And then they become very aware, what we call introception, or in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, it's called pratyahara, getting to know what's happening inside. And this is a pretty intense retreat that lasts for a week. And so Elizabeth Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the enzyme telomerase, found that there was a 40% increase in telomerase activity in experienced meditators. Experienced means they weren't meditating before they came to the course, and then now at the end of the course, we consider them experienced. And this was so surprising that I called Rudy, and Rudy invited some of his other friends, including Eric Schott at Mount Sinai in New York, and we looked at the entire genome. And this is a very small, kind of representative slide, but all the genes that were responsible for homeostasis or self-regulation went up, some 17-fold over baseline. And all the genes that were responsible for inappropriate inflammation went down significantly, genes associated with heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and some very significantly. So much so that when we last met, Rudy and I and Eric, and there was a group of scientists, and Eric said, you know, he was showed this slide, and he said, I can now predict with 96% accuracy a genetic signature for those who are in meditation, a genetic signature those who practice meditation. And so somebody asked Eric, said, Dr. Shah, do you meditate? He said, of course not. And I said, do you plan to? He says, of course not. I said, but you just showed us this slide, genetic signature. He said, yes, I'm going to figure out how to make a drug out of this. So much for our scientific colleagues. Okay, so now we're looking at biofields and we're looking at all kinds of signatures. And this brings us to tonight's topic of how experience modulates, modifies, regulates, switches on, switches off, like light switches and dimmers, the activity of our genes. At this point, I'd like to actually bring Rudy up to the stage. And Rudy is an amazing guy. He's not only discovered the genes, the original genes for Alzheimer's, but also for Huntington's chorea, also for Wilson's disease. If you go to the Smithsonian, you'll see a timeline that started with Mendel and ends with Rudy. In between, you have Watson and Crick. So I'm very privileged to be having worked with Rudy all these years. We have many more plans, but I thought with that introduction, I want to start by asking you a question. Does consciousness guide gene activity?
Let's start with an easy one. Well, yeah, sure it does, because in consciousness, you're interpreting your world and you're taking in sensory information. It's providing meaning. It's triggering thoughts. It's triggering feelings and emotions. And all of this is then translating chemically into changes in gene activity or gene expression. The key is, what are you doing every day that's the same, that's leading to more semi-permanent gene expression programming, because that's really what's determining your overall health and well-being, is your habits and routines. So consciousness and routines really matter most.
So when we talk about consciousness in our little group settings with other people and physicists, the way we define consciousness, because you'll hear so many different interpretations of consciousness, right? So one is, it's the source of all volition. Volition. Lift my hand up. The first step is intention. And after that, it's all easy to explain. But the first step and what happens between the intention and the neural network that goes into action, still a mystery. Okay, after that, it's not a mystery. So consciousness is responsible for volition, unconscious or conscious. In the great traditions of the East, there's no difference. What people call unconscious is referred to as the supraconscious, because that's the part of your consciousness that never sleeps. Okay, it's non-local, but it never sleeps. So volition, but also consciousness is that in which all experience occurs, that in which all experience is known, and out of which all experience is made. And it has certain characteristics. It's formless, you can't see it, but without it, there would be no experience of form. It's self-organizing, as you saw in the embryogenesis video. It's self-regulating with feedback loops. It's recursive in that it repeats what it learned, remembers the history of evolution, but then takes it one step further. Recursive, and whatever it takes further feeds back on the previous arrangement as well. And it is creative interactivity. So the one cell divides into two, and then they interact to divide into four and differentiate. That's sentience. That's basically life. It's the organization of life. So you spoke at length to me about how genes create proteins that in turn regulate the activity of genes, and that as we repeat certain choices, then we can consciously really switch on the genes and switch off the genes that are to optimize self-regulation.
Yeah, I mean, the
Can
most
you explain
important,
the mechanism?
right, I mean, the most important part of the mechanism would be feedback loops, because just at the level of a single gene, when it makes a protein, at some point, somehow, whether directly or indirectly, that protein is going to circle back to affect the activity of that gene. If A creates B, B comes back to somehow regulate A. You don't get away with creating something, and at some point, it's going to regulate you.
So what's responsible for this feedback and this self-regulation?
So at that level, there are many different ways for a protein to go back and affect the gene itself. But then if you go, much bigger, to the 1,000-foot view, just in terms of experiences and memory, every experience we have is creating memory, and then those memories can be recalled in the brain. And then depending on how you recall that certain memory, it comes with certain feelings or thoughts or sensations. And every time that happens, you're creating feedback loops that are stored in two places. You're storing them in your neural network. Your neural network's being shaped by every experience you have based on the choices you make. But your genome is also storing your experiences. So your experience is stored in your genome by epigenetics. So what will happen is if, let's say, every single day you're eating junk food, you're going to be turning certain genes on and off in a program that becomes semi-permanent. I say semi-permanent because you can always reverse it later with a good diet. But what will happen is you actually chemically modify your DNA with things like methylation, or you chemically modify these big protein pillows to package the DNA. This is on the slide. And these chemical modifications, epi means onto, you're actually creating a gene program that reflects the habit that you have. And this is the key point here. A bad habit will force genes to do things to allow you to survive. So genes will be compensatory. They'll start changing their expression. They say, oh no, he's going to McDonald's again. And all these different genes are now turning on and off. And he goes to McDonald's again, and they say, listen, man, let's just methylate ourselves because he's going to go here every single day. We have to deal with this permanently. So now these genes are in some program, and they're trying to help you deal with all this extra fat, salt, sugar, all of the chemicals, the petroleum things, whatever you find in those foods. And at some point, as these genes are trying to help you, just like think about inflammation. Inflammation is meant to help you. Inflammation is a defense mechanism. But there's something called antagonistic pleiotrope. Things that help you in the beginning hurt you in the end. So these compensatory mechanisms end up in the end hurting you over time, even though it's an attempt of the body to deal with your bad habits. Switch to a good farm-to-table organic diet over time. Usually 2 months is a good rule, and now you start to undo that programming into new programming. So that's why I like to use the word semi-permanent.
So that's very important, the organic part of what you said, because it's nature, and it's not contaminated with petroleum, and it's also what your microbiome, your second genome, likes, right?
Right.
But let's go back now, since we're talking about consciousness and memory. You saw that as during this embryogenesis, there's the recalling, in a sense, of the memory of the reptilian brain, the limbic brain, the cortical brain, which require gene activity. And as you and I have discussed before, 65% of our genes are the same as a banana. 80% are the same as a mouse, and a lot of them, 60% are the same as a fruit fly, on and on. Where is the memory in these genes? Is it in the DNA? It's in the nucleotide? Where is the memory? And this is one of the hard problems of consciousness. Yeah. So,
and I'm glad you didn't ask me that in the bathroom, because that's a tougher question. You asked me a much easier question in the bathroom.
So,
but the fact is we don't know. I mean, we know how experience and memory is metabolized to then program gene expression, to program your neural network, 100 billion neurons, up to a quadrillion synapses.
Which are originally made by genes, right?
Right. I mean,
and then sculpted by experience, of course.
We understand that process, but how, when you're born, how is instinct programmed? How are genes programming that baby you showed already in the womb sucking her thumb, already getting ready to suckle when she comes out of the womb? I mean, somehow we don't really understand the programmed instinctive parts of the reptilian brain. And then we further don't understand how the newer limbic system, that's 100 million years old. This is 400 million. The limbic systems were the first place we had memory. And the first memories we had, acquired memories, were remembering something that's good and you want it again, that's desire, or remembering something that was painful or punishing and you want to stay away from it, and that's fear. So fear and desire were the first memories. And then as the world became, as our brain evolved and we're mapping out the world, we're now making bigger and bigger maps of what's good and we desire it, and what's bad, and we avoid it. Attraction, repulsion, from particles to bacteria to us. It's all one pathway, but more information makes it more sophisticated.
So Stuart's going to join us later in the panel, and he's recently been talking about how feelings guide evolution. And feelings are, of course, sensations of pleasure, pain, but also driven by memory, right?
Yeah, and yes, right. I mean, memories, when we recall any memory, memories are not absolute. Anytime we recall a memory, it's different every time, depending on which trace of neurons you use to get there. Yet we don't know how memories are stored. How do you have a memory of your mom's face or a sunset you can see right now in fat, protein, and water? How do how do we store these things, and how do we store instincts in our genes? We have no idea. We're good at looking at how they're recorded and recalled, but we don't have a good idea of the substrate.
So if I remember right now the face of my mother or the food she made for me when I was a child, I have an image, I see her face, I can remember her voice, I can even taste the food. Where was that before I started to recall it?
So, back at my university, my neuroscience training, they would say, well, consciousness and memory is emergent from the material of the evolving brain. That's a very different viewpoint than consciousness being primary, with the brain acting as a conduit to record and recall that information for you. The fact is, at this point in science, we don't know. We just can't answer the question.
So the planet Earth is about 5 billion years old. The first biological organisms appeared approximately 3 billion years ago. Chemolitho-autotrophic hyperthermophiles.
Nice.
In case you want to remember the name. Okay. And they are our ancestors.
I thought you could only recite Rumi. That was pretty good.
It's simple, actually. Chemo, chemicals,
That's tough. I couldn't do that.
litho on rocks, autotrophic, they already knew how to reproduce themselves. Hyperthermophiles, they lived on the rims of rocks and volcanoes. So our ancestors, and then right down to this present moment, all that memory is there. And before that, the memory of cosmic evolution from the moment of the Big Bang. And we don't know where it is. All we know is the signature of these memories in our gene activity, not even in the genes, because, we're sharing the genes with all of life.
Well, every interaction is creating information, and I don't understand how, but somehow information cannot be destroyed, and information that remains is stored as memory. But we experience it at a very primitive level, even though we think it's sophisticated. 100 billion neurons, a few 100 trillion, maybe a quadrillion synapses, still pretty small compared to the universe. But lots of information and a long way to go up. And even if you think about a bacterium in a petri dish, it has a very simple genome, but it still has receptors that say, I'm attracted here, I can mate or eat. I'm repulsed from this, I might die. It's just more information making it more sophisticated, and our brain keeps evolving to still deal with the basics of fear, desire, attraction, and repulsion.
So a poem of Rumi, he says, once I was a particle of light, then I slept in minerals, I started to dream in plants, I started to wake up in animals, and then as a human I asked myself, who am I? It's the evolution of consciousness in the cosmos.
And one of the points we will get to is that when we think about how consciousness is driving our gene expression, a big topic today is transgenerational inheritance. The idea that the gene expression changes you're bringing onto yourself right now with your choices, your behavior, your habits, can be passed on to the next generation. Now, this is if there are certain evolutionary biologists that would just try to shoot me right now for saying that. And in all fairness, we haven't seen direct evidence in humans, but in mice, there are many studies that make it absolutely clear that a mouse can learn something in its adult life, and if it's in that reproductive age, can pass on that learned condition response to the next generation through epigenetic transfer. And this means that Lamarck wasn't completely crazy, and Darwinism needs an add-on, at least an add-on. Maybe not a replacement, but there's more to the story than simple random mutation.
So talk about the experiment in mice.
Well, there are a few really cool ones. When you think back to the end of World War II, end of 1944, when the Germans were blocking the ports and causing the Dutch famine. So we had the Dutch hunger winter, and the Dutch were down to a diet of about 500 calories a day. And if you look at the kids that were born, the babies that were in the second or third trimester during the peak of the famine were underweight, as you'd expect when they were born. But somehow the babies that were in their first trimester during the famine, and now it started to lift around February of 1945. So now by the time this baby's born, the normal diet is back, and the mother was already eating a normal diet at the end of the third trimester. Those babies are born overweight. And then those adults, in a study that was done at Harvard, the adults that were babies in the first trimester during the famine, but then transitioned into that normal diet by the time they were born, these babies, the adults then were more prone to obesity and diabetes. And the thinking is that the mother had to have epigenetic changes to deal with, a 500-calorie diet of potatoes and tulip bulbs. And then over time, as those epigenetic changes were transferred, presumably, to the child, now the child is getting more bang for their buck from the food. So they're eating a normal diet, but getting many more calories and more obese and then prone to diabetes because of inheriting these compensatory protective changes that the mom underwent to survive the famine. Now, there's no proof of that, but when this experiment was repeated in mice just 2 years ago, actually last year, they took a strain of mice that could survive on very small amounts of food and starved these mice, but the mice survive. And then they basically looked at the offspring of those mice, and sure enough, they were born overweight, they were prone to obesity and diabetes, and even the next generation after that, still prone to obesity and diabetes because of the compensatory mechanisms programmed in the mom. And this has profound implications for how we are affecting our own evolution in the next generation, not having to wait millions of years for a supposedly random mutation, according to Darwin.
So one of the most fundamental tenets of Darwinian evolution is random mutation and then natural selection. Are mutations, you look at mutations, right? Including de novo mutation.
That's what I do every day.
You look at, and of course Darwin didn't know anything about genes in his time, so he made major contributions without knowing the specifics. But let me ask you straightforward, as a geneticist who looks at mutations, are mutations random?
Well, I mean, sure, some mutations might be random, but take cancer, right? There are studies, multiple studies that show if you look at where epigenetic modifications are in the genome, you can reliably predict which mutations are going to occur in tumors causing cancer. Epigenetic changes due to lifestyle, then translating into prediction of the exact mutations in specific tumors in different types of cancer. That's not random. And that's fact. These are papers published in Nature and Cell and high quality journals. So, sometimes when you talk to an evolution biologist who only wants to believe Darwin, they kind of don't pay attention to this literature. But it's very easy to explain.
Jerry Coyne.
Don't invoke that name. So the idea is how it works, is that DNA, picture 3 billion beads on a string, and now you fold them up in your hand, and they have 3D structure, and there might be red, blue, green, yellow beads in different stretches. If you hold them one way, these beads are exposed. Another way, those beads are exposed. When epigenetic changes occur on DNA, the 3D structure of the DNA as it sits in the nucleus changes, so certain DNA is exposed, or now you change your lifestyle and now other DNA is exposed based on the packaging and chemical modifications. What this does is it says certain bases of DNA will be more prone to mutagenesis, to being mutated based on how the DNA is folded, and the DNA is folded differently based on epigenetics, and epigenetics is based on your lifestyle, your experiences, and your choices. So so from that argument, it's not hard to understand how mutations can be guided, even long-term mutations, by your lifestyle. Is that clear? Because I went through that. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, this is a very new part of science, trying to understand how three-dimensional structure of your DNA as chemical modifications occur through epigenetics due to your lifestyle, then affecting which mutations will occur and where. We've seen it in cancer. It's already there. And we've seen the transgenerational inheritance in mice. There are at least 4 more examples of mice I can give you.
And
that are really cool.
transgenerational transfer of memory.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you take, there's another experiment where they made mice become afraid of cherry blossoms. So they smell cherry blossom smell, the mouse gets a foot shock. I don't do these experiments, by the way, and I'm a vegetarian. But they get a foot shock, and now the mouse, when it smells the cherry blossom, cowers in the corner. Okay? They take these male mice, they mate them, they take the offspring, these mice are just born, no reason rationally to fear the smell of cherries. They give the cherry blossom smell, and the baby pups, the little mice, cower in the corner. They've inherited the fear of cherry blossom smell and were never conditioned to do so. Now think about people's lives. Think about 9/11. Think about the Holocaust. Think about trauma at home. Think about physical abuse. You know, children that are physically and sexually abused who happen to unfortunately die, you can see epigenetic changes in their brain on receptors that make them, that actually cause memory deficits and even predispose to psychopathic behavior. So it's everywhere in our lives, emotionally, how we're treating each other, determining the fate of our genome. This is the new genetics.
So Rudy, I mean, you're a very cutting-edge, mainstream Harvard professor. I know you've discovered more than, how many, 50 genes?
I discovered 12 Alzheimer's genes, actually.
12, okay, whatever. But
a bunch of other genes, too.
I'm gonna take you
And
a
about
little
50 million mutations, by the way.
50 million
Yes,
mutations.
yes.
Okay. So, and he's been nominated for the Nobel Prize, and last year he was one of the most important.
That's a bad, you don't want to know about
Okay.
prizes. That's a great way to make enemies.
Okay, but I'm going to take you out of
And it's outdated. No 3 people should get a prize these days for anything.
Okay.
It's a team.
So I'm going to take you out of your comfort zone, if you don't mind.
Well, we haven't done that yet.
I think we've been
Your first question, maybe?
So in some of the traditions that I grew up with,
Yeah.
consciousness is fundamental, and matter is actually doesn't even exist. Matter is just an experience of sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts interpreted as something solid out there. There's only consciousness and its modulations. And in fact, that will be my talk on Wednesday on fundamental reality. Mm-hmm. But in these traditions, memory is not in the brain, and memory is not even in the genome. Memory exists. Memory exists in what is referred to as the Akashic field, the Akashic record. It's referred to as the Chit Akash. And when you recall a memory, then just like a wave collapses and appears as a particle, you have brain activity. So right now I have all these memories of my childhood, of growing up, of my parents, of what we had for dinner a little while ago. And they're all there in consciousness, and they're not localized. But as soon as I have an intention, then they localize. but otherwise they exist only as potential memories. They also exist in superposition, all at the same time. For example, right now I'm speaking in English, I'm using words in English, and where is the rest of my vocabulary right now? Okay, the rest of my vocabulary is in superposition. And then very through intention, I'm sequentially ordering the unfoldment of words, hopefully in correct grammar and syntax, so there's meaning. Would you be sympathetic to the idea that memory is in consciousness and guiding the genome and the neural networks in order to process experience?
So,
Did I make sense or not?
no, you did.
See, the
No,
Chitakash
no,
is, this is here, Chitakash. Some people might call it the quantum vacuum. No problems with that. But right here is the Chitakash. Akash means infinite space, and Chit means imbued with consciousness.
I'm sympathetic to that, but I think, I am. But I think that I never underestimate science and the future of science to someday create a model. And okay, so a model that explains it. And we have Stewart's model of microtubule polarity as the substrate for stored memories, and work going on in that area. I think that even if science someday figures out exactly, and it may be the Stewart and Roger's idea, it may be a modification of that. Even if science figures it out someday, it's still just a model that has meaning for us with our species-specific nervous system. In other words, what you're saying can all be true, but we can still possibly have a scientific model that also helps us predict events that also explains what you just said. And so,
Take you one step further.
okay, all right. I mean, let me ask you this. Do you think science can someday explain the Chittakash?
I think science is an activity in consciousness. Scientific theories are conceived in consciousness. Scientific experiments are designed in consciousness. Scientific observations are made in consciousness. So I think science can give us inferential evidence of what's going on, but direct evidence is only through self-awareness, awareness of core being. Now, let me try something with you right now, if you're comfortable with this. Are you aware right now? Some people are nodding. Are you aware? Okay. Who did you consult? You said me? Where's the me that you consulted? Somebody pointed there. Okay, I'm going to ask you the same question. Are you aware? This time, don't answer it till I say this, till I do this, okay? Are you aware? Okay, so are you aware is a thought. Yes is a thought. In between is awareness. So awareness of a thought is not a thought. Awareness of a perception is not a perception. Awareness is entirely formless, but without it, there's no experience. Try this as well. As you're listening to me, just turn your attention to who's listening right now. That's awareness. It's not your mind which might be saying, I wish I'd gone to the bathroom before the lecture. Now that's a thought. Okay, that comes from awareness and disappears into awareness. So yes, I think we'll get a very good idea with all these wonderful quantum physicists here talking about, collapse of the wave function, or how some people, whether they're Copenhagenists or not, it doesn't matter, decoherence. but beyond all form, and all form is phenomena, and all phenomena arises and subsides and is experienced in the formless. And that's what consciousness is. And that's why people have such a hard problem with the hard problem, because they're looking for consciousness in something which is experienced in consciousness.
Well, I think, all of us, going back to when we were children, try to imagine the beginning of the world, right? I mean, you try to say, where did it all come from? And to this day, if we think about a purely material world, it is kind of silly when you to think about material coming out of absolutely nothing in a magical house called the universe. And to me, as a scientist, it makes more sense that if I say awareness, you say consciousness, if this is primary, if awareness is primary and awareness can only be aware of itself, then it's easier to imagine awareness as primary and then all of this being an exercise in consciousness, including what we consider a hard material world. It's just all in consciousness. It's easier for me, honestly, to picture that than thinking about actual material trinkets coming out of nowhere in some magical box-like house called the universe. And so, just going back to that stage, I can accept consciousness as primary, but as we in consciousness generate information through interactions and this self-organization, we'll have Stuart Kaufman up here later, and you have self-organization of this material, we create models, and that's what science is. We're creating models that our brain can understand, which is still a product of consciousness. I'm just saying that in science, I trust that eventually we'll come up with models to explain this stuff, but these are still specific to our own consciousness and in consciousness.
So let's go to something that you're more at home with, back to your comfort zone. The one cell that...
Is that making you uncomfortable now?
No.
Okay.
The one cell that differentiated into a baby, right?
Yes.
And then there was all this self-organization and regulation, and now we know that just like the universe is 96% dark, our genome is 96% non-coding, right?
Actually, it's up to 98.5, 97.5% non-coding.
Non-coding.
2.5% of genes. That's
So I don't think people anymore call it junk DNA. Right?
Intergenic DNA is the
Intergenic
politically
DNA.
correct term.
So
now
what,
for that DNA, yes.
what is it doing? Can you help us? Because that one cell, by the way, interacted with itself to become two, right?
Right.
And then they interacted with themselves to become two. So it was self-interaction all the way.
Right. So in this video you showed, as this, as the developing human is going through, visibly all the different stages of evolution of life on our planet in 9 months, the way these cells are differentiating from a single stem cell progenitor is mainly through epigenetics. The programs that differentiate our cells to make us now we know are mainly due to epigenetic programs. And if you look, at the newest papers out on epigenetics, many of them, half of them, are talking about how epigenetics programs us, our development.
So the epigenetic programs with the intergenic DNA is, I hope you'll excuse me, is memory and karma.
Well, let's take those separately, right?
They're connected.
No, but yeah, so it's a tough one. You have 2.5% of your genome as genes, right? You have other stuff in between. There's many different ways to regulate gene expression and create programs. There's just turning on genes that they're promoters or transcriptional regulation. You can make little mini RNAs, the template microRNAs that attach near the gene and affect its expression, or you can have epigenetic regulation through chemical modifications. All that stuff in the middle is doing this. We're now mapping every single base in that, what we call junk DNA, to see which bases matter to affect the genes 100,000 bases away this way or 100,000 bases that way. This is a big project right now that we're part of, And we're understanding that the whole genome is important in terms of that the bulk of our genome is mainly concerned with regulating that tiny 2.5% that are the genes that make the proteins that together with fat and water create us. But we used to think that was it. And now increasingly we're seeing that modifications of that DNA through epigenetics, that's where it's at, even down from the developing embryo to whether you're going to get cancer. And everything you're doing, right now, we're changing gene expression in everyone in this audience, okay? If they chose somehow to come to this lecture, 5 nights in a row or 2 weeks in a row, and we keep talking about the same things, there are going to be some methylation of your genes, and you're going to be actually changing permanently your gene, and that is memory, right? You're storing memory of what we're talking about with repetition at the level of modifications of genes. And of course, that correlates with changes in your neural network, neuroplasticity. So it says that whether you're a baby developing in the womb or you're a student in life today, sitting in a lecture, that epigenetics is always changing the genome. And if you believe that we do what mice do, we're passing it on to the next generation. We're passing that genetic memory on to the next generation, even down to whether it had to do with being afraid of a spider. And so you have an irrational phobia in a child. Maybe it came because of, the parent or the grandparent.
So anecdotally, every mother will tell you that even if she has identical twins, they have different personalities right from the beginning. Identical twin means exactly the same sequence,
Same
right?
DNA.
And same sequence, right? Of
Same
everything.
sequence of DNA, maybe a few, probably about 70 to 100 changes just to the de novo mutations that occur in everybody. Everybody has about 70 to 100
So is the
mutations.
different personality, different memory? What is going on?
It's epigenetic. I mean, if you take the same embryo and implant it in 2 different mothers, you're getting a different kid. Because epigenetics is helping to determine that child.
Experience.
It's not just a sequence of DNA. And this is, poor Darwin didn't even know about DNA, never mind about modifications of DNA. And so I think, we said it earlier on that we have to, I don't want to swipe Darwin aside, but we need a major reboot on Darwinism, an add-on to Darwinism that says that if you're going to talk about survival of the fittest, that the generation before us directly affected our behavior genetically with genetic memory, and that does affect survival of the fittest as well. And so mutations over the long run, but as far as right now and next generation after, it's our lifestyle, our behavior, and what we're doing to the genome and what we're passing on, assuming that we do it like mice. And that's not a bad assumption. It hasn't been directly shown in humans yet. But then you take 9/11, the children that were born of mothers who directly witnessed the events of 9/11, a study was done, have higher cortisol in their saliva. I mean, there is study after study showing the evidence of children being born with traits that have to do with what the mother experienced or the grandmother experienced. It's just a matter of coming up with the hard evidence.
So another no-no that strict Darwinists have is purpose. Would you say there's some kind of teleology that we're looking at in evolution? Could it be vaguely even suggested that it is driven by purpose towards more complexity?
If purpose includes vision for the future, intention, desire, setting your mind's eye on goals, and then this affecting your overall outlook, perspective, emotional balance, yes, that will affect your epigenetics. And if epigenetics then in turn affects exposure of 3-dimensional DNA to mutagenesis, as we've seen in cancer, yes, there's purpose.
So, it's a word that's very common in current scientific literature is random. Random mutations, random movement of atoms, random everything from the moment of the Big Bang right through, notwithstanding the constants. When I had my debate that you saw with Richard Dawkins, And I said to him that perhaps random is not a good word. We should say unpredictable. Unpredictable means I can't predict what's going to happen, but I don't know if it's inherently random. And I mentioned that Freeman Dyson had said in one of his books that there may be sentience or consciousness from atoms to universe. He said every quantum experiment forces the atom to make a choice. And he got very upset and screamed at me and said, Dyson should sue you, etc. And so I wrote...
Actually, he turned beet red.
He did.
And I was really worried. I was going to try to text you to tell you to lay off. I thought you were going to give him a stroke. It was really...
Well,
I was scared, seriously.
Unfortunately, he did have a stroke last month or 2 months ago.
I shouldn't have
So,
said
yeah.
that. I didn't know that.
But you know, then I wrote to Freeman Dyson, and he said the following. He said, 3 riddles have puzzled me all my life. Number 1, the unpredictable movement of atoms. Number 2, a universe fine-tuned to life and mind. And number 3, our own consciousness. And very gracefully he said, I don't know the answers to these questions, but I think there's a connection. What we call random could be another word for creativity. I go to Grand Central Station, and I see this crowd, and it seems totally chaotic, but everybody's going to a certain destination. I come 3 days in a row, I can even plot a distribution curve. So what seemed random and unpredictable actually is making sense now. And then the other thing he said, the fine-tuning and then our own consciousness. So I would like to ask you now, where are we going in this future of genetics research in terms of how experience and even interpretation of experience, it's not just experience. If I say, I love you, and you will want to hear that, you might get a dopamine hit. And if, on the other hand, you think I'm manipulating you, you might get a cortisol hit, right? It's the same words, but different meaning, right? So where are we going in this epigenetic research? What is the epigenetic roadmap, as this has now been called? And I know you're part of it. And what are people looking for in this epigenetic roadmap?
Well, I think there are, when you think about the brain and what we wrote about in the super brain and then super genes, the 2 analogous words. For the brain, what allows us to be dynamic and change our neural network with every word, thought, deed is neuroplasticity, right? We have a dynamic synapses that are changing all the time. There's neuroplasticity going on right now as people are listening to us. And so there's a great effort going into understanding how we can shape our neuroplasticity to allow our brain to bring us the best world possible. I mean, if you're living in a world that you're enjoying with less stress, you're getting more sleep, you're more prone to want to eat a good diet and feed your second genome, your microbiome, that in turn is going to take care of your genes. Now your brain, through your neural network, is bringing you changes at the epigenetic level that are telling you, hey, I religiously need to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. It takes 2 months of insisting on 7 to 8 hours of sleep that then you will religiously want 7 to 8 hours of sleep. It takes 2 months of eating a new diet, and then your genes take over. As your genes program you, they'll make you want to not eat junk food anymore or petroleum products. So the point is that it starts with your brain and neuroplastic changes based on outlook and choices and celebrating the fact that you have self-awareness, celebrating the fact that you're not your thoughts and your feelings. This is something your brain brings you. Your brain is giving you this gift of self-awareness to observe what's going on. You're in charge of your neuroplasticity. You're guiding it, teaching it, like you would a child. And now your brain is then translating to your genes to affect your gene activity over time, semi-permanently through epigenetics. Now your genes go into autopilot and take care of you. So I think where we're going in the future of health, as drugs become harder and harder to find and have more and more adverse reactions, is basically training ourselves through neuroplasticity and epigenetics to live healthier lives. without having to rely on pharmaceuticals. So I think that's the goal going
Are
forward.
we going to guide our evolution as human beings?
Well, we already are. I mean, I think whether we want to think or not, every single day we're guiding through these epigenetic mechanisms our gene expression, and thus also the future of our DNA in terms of accessibility to mutation. So we're the first species with self-awareness now that's guiding the evolution of our own genome.
So before we ask Stuart to take over again, this is where we are right now. Over several phone calls, Rudy and I came up with this term, SBTI, Self-Directed Biological Transformation Initiative. And now all these scientists have joined us, and we're looking at the effects of all the ways that we can improve self-awareness, including yoga and breathing and adaptogens and even massage and conscious communication. And we're looking at actually everything that is possible to measure. So this project, which is now happening, we have collected terabytes of data, just about everything.
Actually, we're up to a petabyte.
Petabyte.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that we're not measuring as we look at transformations in consciousness.
But this is what's really important, the microbiome.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there are other studies of mice. There are certain mice that that genetically become very fat. They're mice that have yellow fur and they're obese. They're genetically prone to obesity. And experiments were done where the mice were given a diet high in vitamin B, B12, B6, other B vitamins, and the root product betaine, which is a beetroot product. And it didn't help those mice so much, but the mice that were born from those mice had the mutation, yet had brown fur and weren't obese. The simple diet that was given to the parent mice changed the offspring to lose the yellow fur, brown fur, and no obesity. And it just shows what a diet can do. In another study that was done, they took the obese mice and then killed its microbiome, its gut bacteria. And remember that 9 out of 10 of our cells are bacterial, only 1 out of 10 is mammalian. Killed the bacteria in the gut, replaced the microbiome of the fat mouse with a microbiome from a skinny mouse, and even though the mouse had the mutation, the mouse got skinny. The mouse was no longer obese. So it shows the power of the microbiome itself on metabolism, but the microbiome also controls mood, and very importantly, controls inflammation in the brain through the gut-brain axis. So diet, sleep, exercise have never been more important. I mean, you know, a bad diet's the new smoking. Not getting enough sleep is the new smoking. Sitting on the couch too long, eating potato chips is the new smoking. The fact is now we know what we have to do. If we're not doing it, we're hurting ourselves. And this gut-brain axis, where if the microbiome is being given probiotics, fiber, preferably a Mediterranean diet, I'll get into this in my talk on Wednesday, then the gut microbiome takes care of the brain. And the main risk factor in Alzheimer's disease, we often, you know, we talk about I'll talk about this Wednesday, but we talk about the plaques and the tangles that are part of the disease. But you can live with a head full of plaques and tangles, okay? We studied these people who would die in their 90s, and they were cognitively fine, and you look in their brain, and they have tons of plaques and tangles. A neuropathologist says, this was an Alzheimer's patient. What made them resilient? You don't see it very often, but what they all have in common is that somehow, despite all those plaques and tangles that said they have Alzheimer's, they had no inflammation. Inflammation is what throws you down that slope into dementia. And one of the main things that controls inflammation in your brain, studies have been done in multiple sclerosis as well, is your microbiome, your diet. And so I think studying how the microbiome affects brain health and SBTI is very important.
So I'd like to end with just a few insights here. Your body is a process, not a structure. And no longer can we say this is material, this is energy, this is information, this is consciousness. It's one system. Your gene expression is influenced by your thoughts, emotions, relationships, social interactions, and environment. And this is something I learned from Rudy, which most people don't know, Rudy. only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. Can you explain that?
So if you look at the diseases of aging, the biggies, Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, and you ask, amongst all these different mutations associated with the disease, how many of them guarantee you'll get the disease, usually with early onset under 60, and how many of them simply predispose you but can be overcome by lifestyle, like that gene in the obese yellow mouse that could be overcome with the right epigenetic changes from diet. And it turns out that 95% of the variants that we find associated with these diseases predispose you but don't guarantee you the disease in a normal lifespan, only 5% guarantee, which means for the vast majority of what mom and dad gave us as disease-associated variants, we can do something about it with our lifestyle. Epigenetics, starting with the right neuroplasticity, is the key.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was awesome, fellas. Really fantastic. So I'm going to ask the other panelists to come up, Stu Kaufman, Kate Peel, and Baba Brinkman. But while they're coming up, let me make a comment. Rudy especially, epigenetics, at least in C. elegans, is stored in the centriole. And the centriole, when you think about it, is the absolute perfect place for epigenetics because it replicates in a twisting way. So every subunit in all those proteins, the microtubule proteins, can be literally one-on-one duplicated. And also synaptic plasticity, neuroplasticity, which you mentioned, is also a function of the cytoskeleton. So isn't it likely that not only memory, but especially epigenetic memory, is in centrioles and other cytoskeletal structures?
Well, most of the studies of epigenetics in the nucleus, if it's not direct modification of DNA, have to do with modification of the histones, which are the pillow-like proteins that package the DNA and give it this 3D structure. And you can acetylate or deacetylate the histones. There are drugs based on this. Now, histones, in turn, are interacting with microtubules and centrioles. So I think the answer to that is there's a lot we don't understand, and that as we think about DNA structure as part of epigenetics and the future of mutations, you have to bring in its interaction with microtubules as well. But the fact is, we're in kindergarten in terms of understanding that stuff right now.
Well, at least in C. elegans, it's in the centriole.
Yeah.
So not necessarily mammals.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe we should, if Baba doesn't mind, we're going to start with him to make some comments. Baba is going to wrap this up later, literally wrap. And he's also a more or less a conventional Darwinian. So let's hear what your comments about what you just heard.
Well, I'm a conventional Darwinian by reading, but not by training. So my background is I have a comparative literature degree, and I wrote a rap adaptation of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and performed that in England, and a biologist heard it and said, could you rap evolutionary biology? And he set me the challenge of adapting Darwin's findings and their modern manifestations into this series of rap songs. So I became a sort of science communicator via hip-hop and created this show called The Rap Guide to Evolution. So I've had to sort of, keep up with the reading, and my reading of epigenetics, and obviously I'm not a Harvard professor like Rudy is, but from what I've read, we don't see examples of it lasting more than about 3 generations in mammals, 7 generations. Okay, so the sort of orthodox view of Darwinian biology is that there's a genome in each organism that's inherited by the offspring, and the mutations that are changing from generation to generation are creating selective advantages for different individuals in the following population. And each of us is descended from a continuous line of ancestors that goes back to primates and mammals and lizards. And if you don't get past 7 generations with epigenetic changes, then how can we say epigenetics is having an influence on evolution as a large-scale adaptive process by which all of us came to have these forms that we have, these structures, these organs, these brains, these limbs? So
The idea would be that epigenetic changes that last 3 to 7 generations are influencing the behavior of those generations with new epigenetic changes. So epigenetic changes lead to more epigenetic changes, and it becomes a continuum. The same way, from Darwinian terms, mutations are doing this over millions of years. So I think the idea would be that no single transgenerational changes would matter on their own, but they are now, conditioning the next generations and their behavior for the next generation of epigenetic, so recursion.
So that then leads me to the question, would you say that it's behavior primarily that's epigenetically being integrated into evolution, or would you say that physiology is also being influenced in a similar way? Okay. Well, I'm certainly not someone to rule out this playing a major role in evolution, but I think it's been raised on the stage many times tonight that this is a field in its infancy as well. And I don't think Darwin would have objected to the idea really, but he did present his views as an alternative to the Lamarckian view of experiences of organisms being passed on. Lamarck's view was that a giraffe stretched its neck longer, the muscles got longer, and then a baby was born with longer muscles. You would say that Darwin has overturned that sort of physiological Lamarckian view, but you think there's a behavioral redemption of Lamarck. Is that right?
Well, I think there was something called Darwin's special problem or special dilemma, where he couldn't understand how in ant colonies the sterile females turned up every generation. They can't reproduce. And he actually began to propose that the food they ate was determining whether they would be reproductive or sterile, and then this went on to studies of bees instead. So I think if he lived a little longer, he was coming around to the idea that diet can affect your genetics. I mean, he didn't know anything about, he didn't know about DNA, he didn't know about genes. He did an awful lot for not knowing what we know. But he did wonder about how you could see the persistence of certain, sterile female ants every generation when they couldn't reproduce. And he started to touch on it. And even, Lamarck commented on this. So it's not like this would be totally new to him, I think.
I've been called a neo-Lamarckian. Let's hear from Stu Kaufman. Stuart Kaufman is a very famous biologist, a geneticist, world's expert in self-organization, was a MacArthur Fellow, and is very accomplished in many fields. Stu Kaufman.
And thank you, Stuart. So, Deepak and Rudy, I really enjoyed that very much. And as we say somewhere, I take your point, sir. So epigenetics, I'd like to take us back about 30 years. Epigenetics, in the sense of histone modification and changing of gene activities by histone modifications of the kind that you were talking about, Rudy, wasn't known 30 years ago or 35 years ago. It began with the Fragile X syndrome, and we began to know about it. I just reread a book that I commend to you. It's by a superb Nobel laureate named Jacques Monod, and the book is called Chance and Necessity. I truly commend it to you. He wrote it in 1971. So let me take you back and try to bring us forward a bit independently and without taking too much time. When I came into biology, which was in the early 60s, the question was, why in the world are cell types in your body, like white blood cells and red blood cells and brain cells and so on, why are they different from one another? And the problem was that every cell in your body has the same set of genes, but red cells make hemoglobin and white cells make antibody molecules, and everybody knew that. The person I'm commending to you, Jacques Monod, with François Jacob, won the Nobel Prize by discovering something that you said, Rudy, and that we all on the stage know. One gene can make a protein that binds next to another gene and shuts off the second protein from making the second gene from making its protein. That was in 61. In 63, there's a method in my madness, they published a paper that changed my life and that of all of us of that generation. They said, suppose you have two genes and gene A shuts off gene B and gene B shuts off gene A. They said, well, look, this little genetic circuit, like a logic circuit, has two steady states, A on, B off, B on, A off, okay? They said, look, the same set of genes can have different genes active, A on in one cell type or B on in another cell type. And that unleashed many of us to think about what was then thought of as the genetic regulatory network among, we now think, say, 23,000 genes. Okay, we then thought it was 100,000 genes. And the idea is that, roughly speaking, alternative patterns of gene expression correspond to different cell types. And the mathematical term for that turns out to be attractors. Now, the next thing I want to say is the genetic determinism that Richard Dawkins loves is, in a deep sense, right, in a deep sense, it's utterly naive. It takes a cell with the genes in it to make a cell. An organism is made of cells that are living things, and if you just take the DNA and dump it into a bottle of water, or you try to put it in, you took the genome of a fruit fly and stuck it in a plant cell of a plant that's going to make a plant, a baby plant, you won't get anything. It takes the whole thing that's evolved for the 3.6 billion years we're all talking about. Now add to that story, oh, and by the way, before I leave it, as it happens, Rudy works on fruit flies, and I did too for many years. If you take a fruit fly, and you know they have antennas and legs and stuff, they're mutants that change antennas to legs. If during the development of a fruit fly, you happen to expose it to borate salts, and you could say, why borate salts? And nobody knows. The antenna turns into a leg. That's not a thought, that's a chemical. The chemical borate salt turns an antenna into a leg. Or if you expose the early embryo to ether, it develops a second pair of wings and looks like a dragonfly. So these are called phenocopies of what are called homeotic mutants. And it's an amazing story, and there's no need yet to bring in thoughts, consciousness, or whatever. Before we get to consciousness, you all have kidneys. In your kidney are what are called the loops of Henle, and Deepak's a doctor, and you're a geneticist and a biologist, and I'm a doctor and a geneticist, and you're a doctor and a geneticist. Well, you have this loop of Henle, and the descending limb and the ascending limb are right next to one another, and they go, the only thing I learned in medical school that was interesting was the loop of Henle. And the ascending limb has the property that it pumps salt into the descending limb, and the urine's going around it, the blood's going around, and it makes a counter-current mechanism, which fascinated me because it concentrates salt. We don't need any thought or consciousness to think of the morphological evolution that gave rise to the loop of Henle in the last, in the evolution, I mean, fish have the analogs of kidneys too. So is it the case that consciousness in this sense has anything to do with the evolution of the loop of Henle? I don't think so. Now, let's get on to where consciousness undoubtedly plays a role. So first of all, let's bring in the epigenome, and I won't take too long. This is all fascinating new stuff. It's really true that you have a microbiome. It's really true that molecules made in the microbiome affect your brain and your mood and all the things that Rudy and Deepak were talking about. That's correct. By the way, I too think about consciousness, and I think particles may be conscious, and I'll talk about that Saturday, and probably we don't know what we're talking about. Meanwhile, there's evidence that Rudy's told you in post-traumatic stress syndrome and so on that there's epigenetic changes, and they do last to a number of generations. And that's post-traumatic stress if somebody's been around a blown up bomb. Well, okay, that's true, and we didn't know it. So let's put in the fact that that's right, that experience really changes your epigenome, therefore can be genetically fixed after 6 or 7 generations, which is the point I think you're trying to make, Rudy. I mean, if there's change in gene expression, that may allow the fact that a mutation, suppose that, just to make it concrete, that epigenetically you shut off the expression of a gene, and it's shut off for 7 generations. Could you have a mutation that shuts that gene off permanently? Sure, you can mutate it or delete it or whatever, and now it's fixed in evolution for a long time period. That's fine, and Darwin wouldn't have minded it at all. He'd have said, this is fascinating. But meanwhile, you were talking about no longer junk DNA, and then I'm going to shut up. It's now thought that that non-coding DNA, the intragenetic DNA or the intra-intron DNA, are making long RNA molecules that are playing the role of turning on and off histone methylation and modifications, as well as experiences. So leave out experiences for the moment. It's a big dynamical system that borate salts might influence. But meanwhile, your experience to a bomb might influence it too. So it would be, in effect, as if a bomb exploding could turn your nose into your, your gizzard, okay? So we're just at the beginning, let alone what is consciousness, let alone what is memory. And I think I'll shut up here. No, I want to say three other things. Just this. Geneticists and evolutionary biologists have thought about niche construction for years. This is not a new idea. Think of the bower bird. Do we think that consciousness had something to do with niche construction? Of course. Do we think consciousness has something to do with sexual selection? Well, the peacock's male's plumage is pretty fancy, and the girls aren't quite so fancy. Do we think that the girls kind of like the tails? It's hard to imagine that Darwin didn't think that. Darwin wrote a book on the evolution of emotions. So all of those things are there, and yet more. The evolution of tool using and language in humans probably drove encephalization in human evolution and probably drove the enlargement of the skull in us compared to Australopithecus and our early ancestors. So of course consciousness and behavior has a great deal to do with evolution. It's stupid to ignore it. I'm done.
That was great. I think the chemical effects on epigenetics are very important. We didn't talk about it. We do in the book, and especially in the appendix. But if you think about BPA in plastic, you think about pesticides are doing, so many studies are showing that pesticides have huge effects on epigenetics, as does BPA. But I would say that our behavior as a species, our consciousness, is going to determine whether we stop using rotenone or Monsanto products, on our lawn, right? That's consciousness. You're becoming conscious of the fact that we don't want that. We don't want to use Roundup in our yard. And I think that comes from consciousness, and then that translates to less of a chemical insult that's negative on the epigenetics. So it's all, to me, it's one big continuum, but I think on the epigenetics, I don't see it as on and off. It's really also up and down, and there's a continuum, because when you're changing the next generation, chemically, I think that's a great point you make. This is not setting the stage for the next generation. So some of those changes from 3 generations back are going away, but new ones are coming, but they wouldn't have occurred if you didn't have the first ones. So that's why I think it's an iterative sequence that keeps going. So.
Let's hear from Kate Peel, who was originally from Harvard Divinity School and has written about the role of emotions in evolution, and this morning gave a really fascinating talk on quantum hedonism. You can't deny it now.
I did. Guilty as charged. Stuart asked us to think about the question, does consciousness drive evolution? And I was thinking about how I would answer that. And I think I would say that there are 2 ways I think about that, because my work is an emotion theorist, an interdisciplinary emotion theorist. I talk about emotion as the first sensory system to have emerged in living systems, and that the simple positive and negative hedonic qualia that we experience as pleasure and pain was the first sense to have emerged. And I argue that by looking at the molecular circuitry of the E. coli bacterium, and I show how there's a lovely little chemical system that drives with good or bad stimulus from the outside world, internal signaling systems that change the flagellum one direction or the other. And if it's going counterclockwise, the little creature will go forward, or it can turn it the other way to do a little tumble and go backwards. So what we have is a pattern of stimulus response, hedonic behavior toward that which is good for me and away from that which is bad for me. And this is what I argue is a pattern of behavior all observable throughout the entire evolutionary ladder, if you will. And so since this molecular sensory mechanism, sensory motor system was in place, I think very early on with the emergence of life, it continues as part of our cell signaling system, so that the very same signaling systems and ligand receptor cascades are actually how the cell is perceiving its external environment. And the language of all of this beautiful, actually I call the function of emotion the self-regulatory sense, because there's this little lovely cybernetic loop where the cell somehow distinguishes between itself and its not self environment. And through the structures on the membrane, it reads its external environment with the top piece of the little sensory receptor. And then on the bottom, that's inside the cell, because of course it's a transmembrane receptor, there are little methylation marks, which I think is really interesting now that methylation has become such a huge picture in the new epigenetic story. Because what happens is it reads the environment, signals happen, phosphorylation happens on the bottom of the tail, and then the little flagellum will either go clockwise for a tumble or counterclockwise to go forward. But the really cool thing is there's a memory system that works in longer time, where on the little tails on the inside, there are methylation marks that are put on. It's a longer time frame, but it happens to coincide perfectly with the turning of the flagellum one way or the other. So what happens with the methylation marks is if it's increasing, then the flagellum is going counterclockwise and the creature's going forward. So that signal, I argue, is distinguishable from the methylation going down, which is a memory of when something was bad for me and took a tumble. So what you have at this later level, it's in longer time, is a memory system in the E. coli bacterium that categorizes experiences in either good for me or bad for me. And I argue that that process is a physical classical instantiation of sentience and mind, if you will, because it's memory and it allows a sort of a feed-forward loop in the mechanism to where there's anticipation and hedonic urges. But this is only one way that I think about it, because I'm a bit of a closet. I'm more like Deepak in terms of really wanting to understand the dimensions of experience, the multidimensionality of psyche and personality. And I want some good explanations from some of my own anomalous experiences in time, space, and dimensions of self. So when you really look at the system, it's a beautiful chemical machine, just like Jacques Monod would have said. It gives the appearance of teleology, but what it's really just teleonomic. It's the appearance is a machine. But when you really start thinking about it, the essential thing is that there's an ongoing comparison between the self and the external environment. It's not self-environment. And that's what triggers the signal as an imbalance in the system, which triggers the corrective behavior. So it's like a little thermostat. But when it comes right down to it, there's no explanation for the fundamental capability to observe, to compare the self to the not self. So I wrote a little paper. It's a really wonderfully speculative paper about how perhaps what I call the embodied mind, which is this little wonderful machinery that becomes ever more complex. And our brain systems are just wonderfully advanced specializations to do this same signaling. And that ultimately we actually have 3 layers of information encoded in our emotions now that we need to learn how to tap. And when we figure out what positive and negative emotion are really about, actually this is what they're about. Since it's the self-regulatory sense, there are 2 imperatives, if you will, that are mediated by positive and negative emotion. And this is where, does that mean I'm out of time? This is where Lamarck meets Darwin again. You might like this, because when it comes down to it, what hedonic behavior is mediating are 2 attractors, if you will, one of which is mostly mediated by negative emotions, to preserve the physical form. It's about self-preservation, Darwinian self-preservation of body. But there's this whole other dimension that's never been mentioned, the developmental dimension. Even before we knew about genetics, there was the differentiation of cells and all that sort of thing. So positive emotion is really associated with self-development. of the mind, including memory systems. And so that's why we pursue pleasure, because we're actually learning and we're growing and we're actualizing, if you will. So that's what those two things mean. And Lamarck was really onto some of this epigenetic stuff, because he said that critters had felt needs that had a role in. And he was really right about that. Our feelings are huge, because actually what they're doing is they're giving us a subjective reflection of the criteria for natural selection. So as long as we've had the system, our behavior has been instrumental in, certainly in real time and epigenetic, whatever's. But the second way I think about consciousness is that what is it that gives us that self versus not self comparison? And then you get into the hard problem of consciousness. So what I think is really happening is that there is something like, perhaps out there in the universe, the fundamental capacity to observe, which is how I think about consciousness. So there's sort of a dualism between this observation, and it may very well have to do with the collapse of the wave and the actual manifestation of reality via consciousness, but that you need both this, what I call the quantum consciousness, and the embodied mind together to have phenomenal experience. So I would argue that even though there's sort of this dual relationship between the observer, the capacity to observe, where you can have this self, not self comparison, that ultimately there's a monism that is self, if you will, with the capital S. So I like the Thiessen-Kafitos model, where they talk about consciousness being an ultimate monism, wherein an infinite variety of aware components, there's symmetry breaking, where we define our own boundaries, how we're going to, like I can just say that I'm not self, that Stu is not self, and I can be angry with him, and I can pull back my empathic connection from him. I can expand my boundaries out to feel empathy for everyone. So there's something that we can do in how we define who we are that participates in the wonders of who we are. So if there is, as Stu suggests, part of our capacity of our consciousness is converting quantum possibles into actuals, and there's this beautiful cyclic thing going on, then consciousness plays a much, much, much more active role in the manifestation of everything. So I like to think of, we have these self-regulatory imperatives that come from self-organizing processes, but that they're really about self-actualization in the most literal sense, whatever the big selves might be. So that's how I think about the role of consciousness in evolution.
She said it more elegantly than I was going to, so I have nothing to add.
Okay. I would only add that we brought up development and differentiation of cells, and it is pretty amazing that the same stem cell can become so many different types of cells, creating so many different types of tissues and organs, and probably the biggest project in the epigenome roadmap right now is discovering that based on epigenetic marks that you can tell what type of cell a stem cell is going to become, that a lot of the differentiation of our entire body is actually based more on epigenetics and methylation and chemical modifications than on just simple like gene transcription, which is occurring more moment to moment. And so to me, that says that this process, and this is fascinating idea of the flagella epigenetically going one way or the other, attraction, repulsion, going back to a particle with consciousness with attraction and repulsion. It's all one continuum. It's, do I like it or do I not like it? And we're very sophisticated versions of that with a limbic system with fears and desires and a frontal cortex to make sure that our brainstem doesn't put us in jail. We're sophisticated versions of this, but it's increasingly looking like, and I didn't know that story about the flagella, that epigenetics is playing a key role in all of this type of differentiation as we understand it. And the cool thing about it is that we're in charge, that our behavior and our choices, are controlling this. Yeah, it's good. It's good news, I think.
Okay, I'll just say one thing, and I'll leave the rest for my talk on Wednesday. I come from a school which says if you can measure it, touch it, taste it, smell it, hear it, conceptualize it, imagine it, visualize it, it's not real. What is real is the formless, without which none of the above is possible. The formless being or consciousness makes it possible to imagine, think, measure, touch, hear, taste, smell. That is the formless in which all activity emerges as different knowers, different modes of knowing, and different objects known, all in one undifferentiated nothingness.
Do we have any questions from the audience? There's mics up here. If you've got a question, come on up. Here's one brave soul.
Tapas Datta from Bangalore, India. The question is for Dr. Tanzi. I heard you mention a couple of times about 7 generations of probably genetic heredital traits.
That's in a water flea.
Okay, so in humans, has that...
That's the record, 7 generations in a water flea. I think
right.
it's 3 or 4 in a mouse, like you were saying.
Okay, just very briefly the context. In tantric literature, about the 5 energy bodies, panchakoshas, the subconscious or the Vijnanamaya kosha has a whole bunch of influences or impressions. And one of the impressions is from the 7th generation of Pitros, or forefathers. So I thought whether science has been able to gauge in humans what that 7th generation influence may be.
Well, yeah, we don't know what's going on in humans yet because we can only infer from mice and water fleas. But we have anecdotal evidence from the Dutch hunger winter and what happened after 9/11 or the Holocaust. But it's, as you might imagine, it's tougher to track epigenetic marks in a human from generation to generation. And who knows, maybe it will be 7 generations, and as usual, it was all known before, and we discover it with science.
Thank you.
I have a question on the next scientific endeavors for Deepak and Rudy. First, I would like to thank you for being so clear, giving us the argumentation on a coherent approach on lifestyle, how sleep, meditation, nutrition influence genes, activating them, suppressing them. On the other hand, you also mentioned that there is a lot of complexity in terms of neuroplasticity with billions of neurons and trillions of synapses, also thousands of genes or even millions when you take into account the second genome. When you see all this complexity, how can you be a little bit more reductionist and trying to look into any kind of experiments that is going to help people here on what to do next? Is there going to be an experiment or a kind of a study, randomized controlled trial that is going to have a kind of a placebo control? What ideas do you have as, again, next type of scientific endeavors?
I'll make a quick comment and then turn it over. But in this SBTI project, we're doing transcriptomics on all the subjects that are undergoing what we hope are healthy lifestyle interventions. That's followed by mapping methylation marks and mapping epigenetic modifications. And so far, what we've seen are changes in genes involved with inflammation, wound healing, and with meditation, a lot of these genes that cause inflammation or help with wound healing or protecting against viral infection are chilled out. They think everything's okay, so they go down, and that's a good thing because if you have too much activity of them, even though they're meant to help, they can, inflammation can cause damage in the end. But I think that's exactly what SBTI is aimed at doing, is to actually do the first trials and ask, how are healthy lifestyle interventions affecting gene expression, including epigenetic modifications, and that's this multi-center project we're doing. But Any comments on bigger picture?
I think ultimately there are no parts, even though we look at reductionism as a useful way to understand mechanism. There's no such thing as a part. A part is an activity of the whole. By the time you've measured it, it's not even there. So you have to think of one wholeness. In answer to that question about looking at every little detail, that's the only way you can get science done these days. So it's good. We can look at the details and then we can look at how that all correlates. We look at networks. Yeah, definitely.
Isn't the way to look at some of these problems of what we don't know, what we can't understand, as simply saying the universe computes, and when it does, it creates information. Some information we know and can identify, some we can't. Certainly in evolution, we can identify the information that's coded in genes, but you could say the same thing about information in the epigenetic phenomena and processes. And basically, Darwinism and Lamarckianism are indistinguishable that way. And every time every time there's a self-organizing order, there's information that's embedded in some system or network, and then the information, the universe computes on that information. Doesn't that solve a lot of what you say you don't understand yet because we don't know the information?
Yeah, the universe is curious through you.
At the risk of interesting you, I want to challenge one of the things that we live with by way of a little experiment. We are persuaded, I'll call it the Pythagorean dream, that there really are laws outside of the universe that either describe or govern how everything will become. In the last 10 years, I've become, and you all know Newton and Newton's laws, and you have his 3 laws of motion and universal gravitation, and they work. We can get to Saturn using Newton's laws. That's not bad, okay? So I'd like to take just a few minutes because you just raised the notion of information. So you're giving me an excuse. What I want to try to say is the biosphere becomes in a way that is describable by no laws whatsoever, governed by no laws whatsoever. Therefore, the most complex thing we know of in the universe, other than, for example, the human mind, is not governed by any laws, and, pertinent to your point, it creates ever new possibilities for its own becoming. Deepak, this is something that you might find somewhere between fun and interesting. So this is just take a couple of minutes. So I'll ask you, because I don't know your name, but I'll ask you. Please list, this is going to sound really wacky. Please list for me, for all of you, please list all the uses of a screwdriver. So I'm going to hand you a screwdriver. Please tell me all the uses of a screwdriver. So
well,
go ahead.
That's where you get into consciousness of mind, because real intelligence is figuring out all those uses.
Well,
but it wasn't the original information that created the screwdriver.
Yeah, that's what I want to try to challenge us about. So just go ahead and tell me some uses of a screwdriver.
Unscrew a certain number of things, to lever up a window, to puncture someone's tire.
Keep going. This is just fun. Just do it for a couple of minutes, then I'll make my point. Then I'll add to it for a couple. Can you use it to scrape putty off a window?
Sure.
Sure. Can you use it to stab an assailant?
Sure.
Okay. Can I tie it to a stick and spear a fish?
Sure.
Can you tie it to the stick and can you rent it to the locals for 5% of the catch and live in your thatched hut? Sure, right? So, huh? Yeah, you can stab it, you can kill somebody, it's an objet d'art. So, that's French for object of art. So I want to try this on you. Are the number of uses of a screwdriver indefinite, not infinite, not one, but indefinite? Will you buy that?
Sure.
Big move. I've sucked you in, okay? It's indefinite. Now, I just have to tell you a mathematical thing. there's something called a nominal scale. It's just the names of a bunch of things, like Bill, Joe, Fred. Then there's x is greater than y is greater than z. That's transitive. X is now greater than z. Then there's a thermometer. It's an interval scale. 4 degrees to 2 degrees is the same as 2 degrees to 0. Then there's a ruler, and 4 inches is, in fact, twice 2 inches. That's a ratio scale. What we just talked about for uses of a screwdriver is just a nominal scale. That means there's no ordering relationships among them. Now I'm going to claim something, and a bunch is going to follow from this, but I'll do it fast. That means that it's a nominal scale. There's no ordering relationship among them. The number of uses of the screwdriver we've agreed is indefinite. That means that there is no rule-following procedure, or there's no Turing effective algorithm that can list all the uses of a screwdriver, nor an algorithm that can find a new use of a screwdriver. But we all know that James Bond sure can, right? And so can MacGyver. So that tells us something that, by the way, Stuart, this tells us something in a different way that Roger Penrose was talking about. The human mind is capable of doing something that's not algorithmic. Now, I want to now make another point, because it has to do with this funny notion of information. This happens all the time in evolution. They're called Darwinian pre-adaptations, where something is co-opted for a new use. If you cannot list all the uses of a screwdriver, can you have a probability distribution about the uses of a screwdriver? You cannot. If I flip a coin, I can have a probability distribution because I know the possible outcomes. If you don't know the possible outcomes, you can't have a probability distribution. Now, what the biosphere is doing is creating new possibilities for its becoming all the time. So is the technological evolution of the economy making new possibilities for its outcome. This raises the serious question of what we mean by information. The biosphere is becoming more complex. The economy is becoming more complex, yes? But we can't say ahead of time what those possibilities are. And that means something that this is really very interesting to think about. The world is becoming in a way that not only we cannot predict, we can't even prestate it. And because we cannot prestate it, we don't know what the variables are, therefore we can't write down any laws about it. That's why biological evolution is historical. We can't predict, but we can recognize afterwards what happened. I find all of this incredibly puzzling, and it has to do with our notion of what's information. Information is always stated in terms of a pre-stated set of possibles. We can't. So I just wanted to bring this up to us. And this has something to do with consciousness too, I think, because we become, I'll end with this. Alicia Yoaro asked a very interesting question. She wrote a book called Dynamics in Action, and she said, could you cash a check 50,000 years ago? Of course you couldn't cash a check 50,000 years ago. What had to happen so that we can cash checks, which we no longer do, right? We have become in some way that nobody could have said 50,000 years ago. So it's not only true of biological evolution, it's true, if you will, of our collective consciousness. So I've thrown this out at us because I find it deeply puzzling. In short, what I'm saying is that we don't know what we mean by the word information.
True, you can start with information theory.
I've puzzled us.
Let's go over there.
A very short question. What is relation?
What?
What is relation between microchimerism and microbiotic in terms of influence of our genome? Is this microbiome influence our genome? As recently fascinating publication about microchimerism.
Did you ask what is innovation? Innovation?
No, microchimerism. Yes, you probably know.
Microchimerism.
Yes, yes. What the relation with what you discuss as effect of microbiome of genome?
You talking about chimerism in our genome?
Yes.
I mean, we didn't talk about that tonight, but I mean, yeah, we're learning that not. We study genetics by getting whole bunches of tissue and cells together and then getting a consensus DNA readout. But the fact is every cell has its own story. And if you laser capture individual cells and look at the genome in each cell, whether it's epigenetics or the sequence, from cell to cell, you see huge amounts of differences. And I think, I'm not sure if this is where you're going with the question, but whether it's the microbiome and our bacteria or whether it's the mammalian cells, every cell tells its own individual story. And part of what's held us back in genetics is looking at genetics of groups of cells and tissues altogether, especially in the brain. And a big direction going forward is chimerism, seeing differences in the genome of each individual cell, differences in epigenetics in each individual cell, that cells have their own self, so to speak. And this is a big movement, especially in neuroscience right now. I'm not sure if that was an answer to your question, but it sparked that memory, that idea. So.
The example is yes, there is connection, but we don't know precisely in each case, right?
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm interested in the ways that new science and technology may or may not impact public policy. And so I was really fascinated by some of the things that you all said, particularly about how nutrition in pregnant mothers may or may not be able to affect some aspects of the offspring's health, long-term health. And so part of me was sort of heartbroken thinking about undernutrition and malnutrition in other parts of the world and the sort of debilitating effects that might be having on future generations of many billions of people. And I also thought that perhaps prenatal nutrition counseling should be much more important in our society. And so what I want to ask is, how much more knowledge and how much more certain do you need to be in what new knowledge is being produced in order to start making very vocal public policy recommendations?
There are 28 healthcare lobbyists in Washington for every congressman. So don't even think about it.
Yeah, but the fact is, at the scientific level, I think we are understanding, especially the effects of stress, diet, sleep, chemicals, especially pesticides. And I mean, if the literature on epigenetics in terms of chemicals is richest when it comes to the effects of pesticides and insecticides. So we can talk about diet, but really, I think the elephant in the room are the chemicals that mothers are exposed to every day. Whether it be rotenone or Roundup, or we don't know what these things do. We don't know what byproducts and plants of GMO manipulation are doing epigenetically. We don't even know when we're eating GMO foods and whether there's changes. So I mean, I think it's a learning process and it's something we have to pay more attention to. But we just had Earth Day the other day, and this is probably the most important thing we have to think about for epigenetics is how we're polluting the Earth and what this is doing to our genome. And how can we turn that around?
Okay, we're running short on time. Let's have a few more. Try to keep them brief, please, and the answers brief.
So my question is in regards to the function of non-coding DNA. So I've read that a group of Harvard linguists actually applied a language test to DNA, and this test, if you apply it to any book written in any human language, it passes. If you apply it to coding DNA, it does not pass, but when they applied it to non-coding DNA, it passed. So could you speak on that at all?
Anybody know about that? Yeah, I'm not familiar with the study, but we'd love to find out about it.
I think you stumped them. That's a very good question.
Yeah. The idea that if you take intergenic DNA, and I think the idea is to turn that into I know people turn it into music, and I don't know if there's a difference between coding and intergenic DNA when you try to turn sequence into music.
Is this the peak noise distribution that you're talking about?
I think it has to do with frequency of certain segments and how those repeat. So language written words will have small words repeating a lot.
Right.
And
Right. So I just want to get the claim straight because it's news to me. So it's well known for music, it's well known for the Bible or for Shakespeare, that if you look at things like the distance between the same word, okay, in Bach, for example, the same musical phrase, it's distributed as a power law, namely the intervals. There's a lot of short intervals and there's not many long intervals. You plot log one against log others, you get a straight line down to the right. So it's in a log-log plot, a straight line is a power law, and it's called pink noise. Is what you're saying is that coding DNA or non-coding DNA shows pink noise?
Non-coding.
Because they're repeats. The repeats are only a non-coding.
So I don't know anything about it, but it sounds neat.
I was going to say that if you look at the genome, it's full of repeats, it's full of retroviral sequences. The majority is repeats, but that's only in the intergenic regions. In the coding regions, you have smaller repeats of amino acids that can cause diseases if they get too big. But most of the, if you're going to do a study like that, I think you see most of the interesting patterns in the intergenic DNA. And
So for the biologists on stage, I'd like to know what you think of the work of Kramer at Harvard, I believe several other people elsewhere, that showed, at least in single-celled organisms, an ability to partially direct the mutations to parts of the genome that are relevant for their survival. If they're deprived of sugar and that's the only thing they can metabolize.
So you're talking about taking E. coli or yeast, growing them in nutrient-poor media, and then seeing the immediate appearance of compensatory mutations. Right. And are those occurring? Are those actually occurring on site as a compensation for the lack of nutrients? Others would say no. There were a small number of yeast and E. coli that had those mutations, and now they become opportunistic and take over the culture. So I think jury's still out on whether there are instant new compensatory mutations when single-cell organisms are challenged with a stressful environment.
The experiment of 10,000 generations of E. coli that Richard Lenski did, where they were unable to digest citrate, he actually had stored frozen samples of each generation going back like 20 years, and he was able to show that the mutation didn't exist in the line, and it was a novel mutation to digest citrate. But I don't know about yeast, but it's definitely happened in E. coli.
And that's the point I was trying to make about epigenetics, is that if it starts with an epigenetic change, that's going to change exposure of DNA to mutagenesis. So I think, to me, epigenetics, I think there's much to be done, but you can at least imagine how epigenetic changes can affect where mutations are going to occur and making mutations not so random. And certainly in tumors, beautiful work on how epigenetics predicts what mutations will be on what tumors. So I think there's lots of mounting evidence against random mutations having to always be random. And that's an example.
Yeah, that was sort of the basic thrust. Yeah.
Let's try to be brief so we can, we have to finish.
Okay. It's been well documented in the animal world that certain animals seek entheogens in the fungal and plant kingdoms in terms of stress or to go into like a mating frenzy. Like reindeer dig up fly agaric mushrooms, jaguars eat the leaves of the ayahuasca plant before hunting. Rats seek out Hawaiian woodrose seeds, which contain LSA, a precursor to LSD, in times of stress, like in thunderstorms. I personally, I've got a background in microbiology and genetics, and I worked for 2 years in a drug and alcohol addiction clinic in London and saw people that used ayahuasca and ibogaine were almost miraculously cured, whereas conventional methods didn't work. And I'm collaborating with several psychiatrists in Switzerland at the moment who almost completely turned their back on conventional methods to treat people with PTSD, rape victims, people with addictions, and they're getting incredible results. It was popularized by Terence McKenna in his book, The Food of the Gods, that early humans, when we were hunter-gatherers, we consumed such compounds from like magic mushrooms, etc., and that catalyzed evolution. What are your thoughts on this?
We're all for it.
Hi, dear Professor Chopra. It's nice to see you. I have been following your teaching for many years, and to me, the consciousness creates matter, and the formless create form, and consciousness is fundamental. This has to be true. Instinctively, I feel it has to be true. It has to be the truth. What frustrates me is that it remains a philosophy, not a scientific theory. That's what frustrates me, because it lacks the next level of details. For example, what's the mechanism? How consciousness actually create matter? For example, can I ask you a question? How does consciousness create time?
The first part of the question is easy to answer. Matter doesn't exist. What we call matter is a concept for an experience of sensations, images, perceptions, thoughts, and knowing. So when I look at an object, I can describe it in terms the scientific way. This is an object, three-dimensional in space-time. But another way to describe it is it's a mode of sensing, knowing, feeling, and thinking. It's a modulation of awareness. So it's me.
Yeah,
And the same thing applies to my body, by the way.
Yeah.
My body does, or my brain doesn't have any special priority in terms of being special. The brain as a perceptual object is modulations of experience. The body as a perceptual experience is modulations of knowing, feeling, thinking, sensing, perceiving. So matter is a form of consciousness. From a perfectly scientific point of view, I had the opportunity of interviewing Wilczek, the Nobel laureate. And so I said, when you get down to, first of all, only 4% of the universe is atomic. Of that 4%, 99.9% is interstellar dust. The visible universe, the visible atomic universe with all the billions of galaxies, is 0.01%. But the atomic universe is made of particles. The particles have dual character. They're waves. And in one level, they're in superposition. So what's going on? I asked him. He said, matter has potentials that we didn't know about before. Well, when you start talking about potentials and matter in the same sentence,
that's consciousness.
That's consciousness.
Yeah, I totally buy what your model describes, and you also actually try to make it one step further, explain it in kind of modulation. But to me, that's still a philosophy. It's not science yet.
I wonder if I might add some thoughts.
Yeah.
This is something that we all know. First of all, we all know that quantum mechanics has replaced Newton. We all know that quantum mechanics has not been united with general relativity, which is the end stage so far of classical physics. Now, I'm going to point out something that you all know. You all know that there's a fossil record from the origin of life on Earth some 3.7 billion years ago to now. And there's fossils out there of Tyrannosaurus rex and human ancestors and trilobites and plants and so on. Yes, and fish. Now, for all of us, even though the physicists don't know how to get the classical world, they don't, the record in the rocks is utterly, utterly vast, and it's completely non-random. Linnaeus could put it in the hierarchy, yes? So part of what we have to think about is whatever else is going on, it's really true that there's a fossil record. It really is, okay? So in some sense, it can't all be, and Deepak, I'm going to now switch. Conceivably, okay, you could try that, but meanwhile it's there. Whatever else is true, it's there. So one of the things that we have to do is say, how is it there? And then the standard explanation is Darwin, roughly speaking, in evolution. Now, the other side of it, and this has to do with the fact that we don't know where the classical world comes from out of quantum mechanics. The other side of it, Deepak, that I want to say in conjunction with you and with you also is, not knowing where the classical world comes from, there's a phenomenon called the quantum Zeno effect, that if you keep measuring a system, it stays trapped in a single quantum state. My suspicion is, and I think it's testable, but I won't go into it now, maybe we can get the classical world out of the quantum Zeno effect, which would effectively be measurement, consistent measurement, and therefore possibly mind-like observation stops the Schrodinger equation and gives rise to a classical world. Possibly. And then that would be something like what you're talking about and you're talking about, but something like a classical world could come out of something like mind by measurement. It seems to me not to be impossible, and again, it's testable.
Let me just say that general relativity and quantum mechanics can be reconciled through consciousness. But let's go on to the, just one more question over.
Can I just add that?
So, Stuart, evolution of species could also be evolution of species of consciousness.
Yeah, how consciousness creates matter, actually. I'm presenting...
Collapse of the wave function. We're going to be talking about this all week.
Yeah, I just add that I have a poster session on Wednesday, and I'm presenting a mechanism, a model. I hope you have time, we can have a chat, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, poster number 8. Yeah, thank you.
Just one more over here, please.
Thank you. My question is regarding Dr. Chopra explained Chidaka's collapse of wave function and retrieval of memory, the hypothesis what you presented. Similarly, can any Eastern concepts like Samadhi, which is called trance, or Atma Sakshatkar, which is called self-realization, be explained in terms of quantum mechanics or quantum biology?
Samadhi's absence of subject-object split. So Samadhi is an experience of non-local awareness. So you have gone from the physical world back to the world of potentiality in Samadhi.
Can it be explained from quantum mechanics or quantum biology so far? Means any hypothesis on that?
I don't know.
Subject-object split is collapse of the wave function. Ingrid from Sweden.
Thank you. Ingrid Fredriksson, Sweden. My poster on Friday is on epigenetics. And you can see I have the Dutch hunger winter and the mice and the brain and the gut. And the name of it is, can consciousness influence our epigenetics, and can epigenetics influence our consciousness?
Okay, we'll check it out.
And I hope our good genes are on and the bad are switched off. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Baba, are you ready? Okay, folks, here's the wrap-up from Baba Brinkman, the consciousness rapper.
So one of the reasons that I'm here in the first place is Stuart asked me to come and be a sort of rap summarizer of the conference. So while I'm listening, I'm taking notes and synthesizing, and must be some kind of neurological explanation for how the brain can do multiple things at once, but here's what I wrote over the last couple hours. I guess I'm supposed to give the dissenting view in a rap rhyme. Okay, say hello to the bad guy. Actually, I'm not so bad. I just think everything evolutionary is awesome. I'm not the one torturing baby mice with the smell of a cherry blossom. Rudy. I say evolution is nothing but random mutation which leads to variations which is subject to selection creating adaptations, and I channel that into a rap with a certain musical rhythm. The rest of my vocabulary is floating around me in a quantum superposition. You think you're listening to a demonstration of evolutionary rap and skills? Nah, actually it's just the collapse of the waveform in my akashic field. According to Deepak, you can hear that I'm sick when I spit it, but is it a Darwinian adaptation, a local field, or something epigenetic? Hey, here's the truth. My father was born in Holland in the 1940s after the Dutch famine. That's true. And now my dad gets the blame for my lifelong junk food habit. And maybe my daughter will even get it via epigenetic methylations, but there's no evidence in mammals that it goes on past a couple of generations. Your genes are your genes, and yes, you can influence their expression, but they're still the same genes. All you change is the switches. So let's give it to epigenetics, though. Those switches, they're pretty powerful. That's how you can give a baby mouse a deadly fear of a flower smell. It all depends on the direction the switches are going. Like, for instance, earlier tonight, Deepak uttered the words, Jerry Coyne. I don't know if you noticed, but it caused a reaction. And Rudy, he turned white, like, don't evoke that name. They recalled from it like burning your hand on a flame. So let's run a little experiment. Say it with me. Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne. Yeah. In the world of epigenetic craziness, now both Rudy and Deepak's children will be born with the fear of skeptical atheists. And anytime someone talks about survival of the fittest, extra cortisol will appear in the saliva of their grandchildren. This is just a basic summary of a standard textbook chapter. That's what you get for assigning rebuttals to a rapper. Consciousness is guiding evolution with the force of a twister in a lab using CRISPR under the supervision of Craig Ventnor. Of course, there's more to evolution than just mutations and deletions. There's a microbiome that controls mood and obeseness. But now I flinch whenever I hear the word microbiome in speeches, because Deepak just had to remind us that each of us inhaled our microbiomes from our mom's vaginal secretions. I thought we were here for flights of beautiful fancy. I came to get schooled on the generational limits of epigenetics by Rudy Tanzi. Consciousness is either in the neurons or a non-local field of energy, but it's simply not needed to explain the loop of Henle in your kidney. So let's say I like to write the lyrics of a rap. That's the genome. That's what you're listening to right now. It's not a free poem. It's not improvised or off the top of my dome. It was invented as I listened to this workshop unfold. I've got a script. I'm reading the words as I speak on the mic. I got a script. I'm reading the words. I lost my script. Here it is. I got a script. I got a script, and I'm reading the words as I speak on the mic. The performance is temporary. It's not the genes. It's the phenotype or the gene expression. A performance of the genes on the page. The question is, does the performance cause the words on my screen to change? How could it? The words are in my phone. The rap is on my tongue. I can send you the text in an email after I'm done. And you could email it to your cousin in Saskatoon and tell her to perform the rap and post a video of it on YouTube and watch the style of her performance and where she places the emphasis. What'll happen next, according to an epigeneticist? If I recite a certain word with a certain emotion, whether lust or anger or something else, some intense passion, would she feel those emotions in the words if she had never even heard me rapping and experience mutations in her own performance, non-randomly resulting in transcendental poetical travesty worthy of Rumi, who began as a dual wave and particle of light flashes refracted from the jewels embedded in Deepak's eyeglasses, becoming an individual questioner, ready to set it, to dig into the concepts of consciousness and epigenetics. I don't know the answers, but I know I'm coming crazy with it. That's it, I'm done. I would drop the mic, except already the Swedish lady did it.
All right, let's hear it for Baba, Rudy, Kate, Stu, Deepak. And thank you all for coming. Have a great evening, and see you all tomorrow at the conference.